Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Denisha Rajendran, and I am the moderating the ninth YouTube session of the eighth fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 11 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in the session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. We have a very special guest with us today for our live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session, the fabulous best-selling YA fantasy author Roseanne A. Brown. Roseanne was born in Kumasi, Ghana, and raised in Central Maryland. She holds a bachelor's in journalism from the University of Maryland, where she was also a TA for the school's Jimenez Porter Writers House program. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And was later an assistant English teacher in Japan. Her first series is A Song of Wraiths and Ruin duology. Rosie has also generously donated a couple of exclusive goodies to the stash of author goodies. The first goodie is Rosie's Epic Starter Bundle for US donors only. Rosie has a very special treat for one US based Read for Pixels donor, which is one paperback copy of A Song of Wraiths and Ruin, signed and personalized for the donor. One set of the A Song of Wraiths and Ruin pre-order incentive pack which includes a book plate, a bookmark, and 2 character cards. The second goodie, which is available to donors worldwide, is a 45-minute one-to-one online video chat with Roseanne A. Brown. So Rosie has generously donated a 45-minute one-to-one video chat to be claimed by one Read for Pixels donor who is an aspiring author or book fan. Rosie will be happy to chat about everything from African folklore to the art and craft of writing powerful and unique YA fantasy with you. You may choose to have know we've currently raised $2,615 towards our $5,000 goal so far, which is a little slow. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends in October 2021. All of the funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Rosie questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Juliana, who is our producer for today, and also chat box moderator, will relay them to me to be read out to Rosie to answer. And now over to Rosie. Welcome to Read for Pixels. Rosie, what will you be reading for us today?
Thank you so much for having me. So today I'll be reading an excerpt from A Song of Wraiths and Ruin. So for those who don't know, the book is inspired by West African folklore and follows two protagonists, a princess named Karina, she's the one on the cover, and a refugee named Malik. And so when Malik's younger sister is kidnapped by a vengeful spirit, he strikes a deal that in order to win her freedom, he must kill the crown princess of the land. So he enters a competition to marry the princess so they can get closer to kill her. However, he doesn't know that the princess's mother has just been assassinated. And to bring her mother back to life, she discovers a spell that needs the heart of a king. So she has started this whole competition just to find a guy, marry him, and then kill him to bring her mom back. So he's trying to kill her, she's trying to kill him. Neither of them are aware of this. And the book is about the things that happen as they sort of plot around each other and what happens when they realize they have more in common than their enemies would like them to have. So for today, I'll be reading chapter 2 of the book. It's actually the second chapter, but it's the first chapter from the point of view of Karina because we see both Malik and Karina's POVs. This is her first introductory chapter. And it starts with her doing some rather unprincess like duties deep in the city. And I hope you enjoy this taste of A Song of Wraiths and Ruin. The Dancing Seal was one of those establishments that was both older and dirtier than it had any right to be, with a questionable layer of grime covering every visible surface as well as the staff. However, the food was great and the entertainment even better, which is what had brought Karina to the restaurant near the outer wall of Zoran. While Aminata sulked beside her, Karina kept her eyes trained on the musician currently commanding the crowd, a stout, oud-playing bard with a mustache so perfectly coiled that it had to be fake. Appearance aside, the man had skill, and from the easy way he swaggered around the circular stage in the center of the room, he knew it. The audience for the evening consisted mostly of travelers and merchants, their faces lined from years of trekking the unforgiving desert roads. In the chatter of the crowd, Karina recognized Kenxia, a language of the Arquasian people from the jungles north of the Ojibwe, Tahoga, a language spoken on the Eastwater Savannah, and even the occasional word in Darajat screamed at frightened Eshran servers. Every major group in Sonande was represented that night. But best of all, no one knew who Karina was. Seated on low cushions around tables laden with thick bean stews and steaming cuts of lamb, the audience howled suggestions at the bard, each raunchier than the last, and sang off key to every piece he played. Solstaja made even the most miserly freer with their purses, so many in the audience were well into their third or fourth drink of the evening, even though the sun had yet to set. The bard's eyes met Karina's, and he grinned. She cocked her head to the side, angelic innocence spreading across her face in response to the brazen suggestion on his. Are you going to stand there looking pretty, or are you going to play something worth listening to? She challenged. Another howl went up through the audience, and the man's dusky cheeks purpled. Despite its less than sanitary appearance, the Dancing Seal was one of the most respected music venues in Zoran. Only the best musicians could win over the crowd here. The bard proceeded to play a raucous song that detailed the doomed love affair between a lonely spirit and a poor slave girl. Karina leaned back on her cushion as she examined the man. Her original appraisal had been correct. He was quite talented, twisting the melody in time with the shifting mood of the audience and biting into the tune at the story's climax. If she had to guess, he was likely fire aligned. That alignment had a flair for the dramatic. Smoothing her headscarf to ensure not a single strand of her hair fell out of place, Karina leaned toward her companion. Do you think he oils his mustache every day to get it that shiny? I think we've been here too long, replied Aminata, angling herself away from the suspicious liquid that covered their table. We've been here 10 minutes. Exactly. Karina rolled her eyes, wondering why she'd expected any other response from her maid. Convincing a fish to swim on land would be easier than convincing Aminata to relax for even a single night. It's Solstage, Amina. We may as well enjoy ourselves. Can we at least go somewhere that isn't filled with people who would stab us? Karina began to retort that technically, any room that had people in it was filled with people who could stab them. But the bard switched to a song Baba had used to play for her, and a dull pain like a mallet banging the inside of her skull cut her off. Squeezing her eyes shut, Karina breathed out through her teeth and gripped the edge of the table until splinters dug into her skin. Aminata frowned, realizing at once what had triggered the migraine. We should go before it gets worse, she suggested, in that careful tone people use whenever Karina's grief discomforted them. Not yet. This was likely the last moment of freedom Karina would have until Solstasia ended. Migraine or no, she couldn't let the opportunity pass her by. A cheer resounded through the restaurant as the bard strummed his last note. He collected his donations in a velvet coin purse, then strode over to their table and dropped into a low bow. I hope you find my performance tonight as pleasing as I find your appearance. Fighting back the wave of dizziness that often accompanied her migraines, Karina raised an eyebrow at the man. Perhaps she might have found his appearance pleasing as well if she had been nearing 70. As it was, she was only 17, and he reminded her of the toads who croaked in the fountains of the palace. The corners of her mouth tilted up, but she didn't smile. It was impressive. Karina's gaze slid to the coin purse on his hip. If I may ask, exactly what do you plan to do with your earnings? The bard licked his lips. Give me an hour of a time, and you'll see firsthand what I can do. Aminata gave a barely concealed snort as Karina replied, I think I know of a perfect home for your coins. And where may that be, my sweet gazelle? He leered. Karina checked his left palm. No emblem, meaning he was unaligned. This man was from somewhere very far from here. The Eastwater Savannah, perhaps. In my pocket. Karina leaned forward until her nose was inches from his, close enough to smell the orange essence he definitely oiled his mustache with. I'll play you for them. One song. Audience decides the winner. Surprise, followed by annoyance, flicked across the bard's face. Karina bit back a laugh. Do you even have an instrument? I do, Aminata. Aminata sighed, but dutifully passed the leather case in her lap to Karina. The bard sneered when he saw the state of Karina's oud. Thin cracks lined the instrument's pear-shaped body, and the floral patterns Baba had carved into its neck had long faded beyond recognition. But holding the last gift her father had ever given her sent a wave of calm flooding through Karina, dulling the ache in her head. If I win, said Karina, nonchalantly tuning one of the oud's 11 strings, I get all the money you earn today. And when I win, said the bard, you will give me the honor of calling you mine for the rest of the night. It took all of her self control not to visibly gag. Deal. In the spirit of nostalgia, I'll allow you to pick the song. The bard's eyes narrowed, but then his grin widened. The Ballad of Bahia Alahari. The pain in Karina's head throbbed anew as her heart constricted. Baba had loved that song. Refusing to let her opponent see he'd rattled her, Karina simply said, After you. The Ballad of Bahia Alahari was a mournful tune that told the story of how the first Sultana of Zoran had ballad her own husband, the faceless king, when he had sided with the Kenwan Empire during the final battle of the Pharaoh's War. Within minutes, the audience had tears streaming down their faces, many even openly sobbing. However, a number of patrons, many of whom were noticeably non-Zorani, seemed unaffected by the performance, and Karina kept her attention on them as her opponent played. With one last haunting note, the bard lowered his oud as a raucous cheer filled the air. Your turn, he said, his eyes roaming over her body with a predator's gaze. Karina stepped forward, moving her hands into position and ignoring the snickers at her instrument's destitute state. Yes, her opponent was good, but she was better. Too fast for anyone to stop her, Karina leapt from the stage onto the table in front of her, earning startled yelps from its occupants, and slammed her sandaled foot on it in a steady rhythm that echoed out the restaurant. Though Karina wasn't facing her maid, she knew Aminata was clapping along, scowl and all. In seconds, everyone in the room had joined her in the beat, banging whatever they had on hand against their tables. Grinning a grin that would put our hyenas to shame, she began to play. It was still the ballad of Bahia Alahari, but Karina bent the melody almost beyond recognition. Where the bard had focused on the stifling yet beautiful grief the song was known for, Karina pushed the beat to a frenzy, playing at a speed normally used for the fastest dance songs. She brought the song to a crescendo where she should have quieted, and bit into the parts that were meant to be soft. Through it all, the song never lost the undercurrent of sorrow for which it was famous. But it was sorrow converted into manic energy, the only kind of sorrow she knew. Karina sang the first verse in Sarani, turning in a circle as she played so every person could hear. For the second verse, she switched to Kentia. A delighted cry went up from the group of Arquatians, engaged in performance for the first time that night. Then she went to Tohoga and back to Kentia. With each verse, Karina made sure to hit a different major tongue of Sonande. The only language she did not sing at least a line in was Darajat. None of her tutors had considered the language of Eshra important enough to teach her, and she lacked the incentive to learn it on her own. The cheers of the audience drowned out Karina's last notes. She smiled sweetly at the bard, who was ready to toss his instrument to the ground. I'll be taking that. Karina grabbed his purse and bounced it in her hand. There had to be at least 100 daira in there. I want a rematch, the bard demanded. Rematch with what? What else do you have to lose? His face twisted into a pained grimace as he pulled a heavy object from his bag. I have this. In the bard's hands was the oldest book Karina had ever seen. The green leather cover sported bite marks around the edges, and time had yellowed the pages with mold. Faded almost to invisibility, the title read in Zerani, The Tome of the Dearly Departed, a comprehensive study on the curious matter of death within the Kenwan Empire. The man who sold this to me couldn't even read the title, said the bard. He didn't realize that he had pawned away a true remnant from the time of the pharaohs of old. A shiver ran down Karina's spine as she eyed the Kenwan glyphs embossed on the book's cover. Reading had never been her preferred pastime, and she neither needed nor desired a dusty old book about a culture long lost to history. If this book is so special, why are you gambling it away? Anything worth obtaining is worth sacrificing for. Karina wasn't one to turn down a challenge, no matter the prize. Barring a smile that showed all her teeth, she unstrapped her oud from her back. One more round.
That was a very good reading. Just before I start with our questions, we have a question from our audience. It's from Julia Costa. I'm just getting the question. Do you plan to go on a tour worldwide for your book once it's safe? What about Brazil?
Excellent question. So I would love to go internationally, but authors, it's not, we don't really get to decide which, number one, we don't decide which countries buy our book. And number two, we don't decide who invites us to these things. So I would love to go to Brazil. Rates was recently published there, and the reception has been amazing. But the best way to get authors like to countries, or like especially U.S. based authors, to get them to countries outside the U.S. is to just be vocal about which books you love, which authors you love. Make sure the publishers know, because the publishers, they keep track of that stuff. Like my Brazilian publisher, they have been very aware of like how vocal Brazilian readers have been, and so once they see the demand is there, that there's people who want to see these authors who will come and see them. Like if they pull these events, there are people who will come. Should they get a translator? Like once they see that, like they're more likely to invite me. So I would love to go on a tour, but I don't really get to plan that. That just really comes down to, is the readership there, is the demand there, and like will the publishers think, yes, it is worth it to like bring this author to this country.
Thank you, Julia, for that question. I do hope that at some point that becomes a reality. So I shall move on to our first cluster of questions. Your A Song of Wraiths and Ruin duology features an ambitious female protagonist, Princess Karina, which we saw earlier during the reading, who is a complex character with agency and is also very human and flawed. What or who are your inspirations for Princess Karina and other female characters in your book?
So with Karina, one of the big, so I often tell people that like Aladdin was a big inspiration for the Song of Race and Ruin duology, because I've always been a big fan of like the princess and like the commoner trope and like exploring that. And so I think Jasmine, Princess Jasmine from the Aladdin movie is one of the big early sort of inspirations, like this idea of this princess who like she has so much fire and she has so much spirit and heart, and she's in a situation where she is very confined by the law, especially this law that she has to marry a man to be able to like when she comes of age and all this, and like just the way that Jasmine, like she's not very strong at fighting. Like she's not like someone who's gonna pick up a sword and start fighting, but she doesn't let that stop her. And like she always like she speaks her mind, and like even when it doesn't always work, she comes says what she needs to say. So Karina was that was a big inspiration for Karina. I knew I wanted to write a princess character because I love Disney movies. I love princesses. I love exploring all the pretty dresses and all that. But I also love exploring those responsibility. Like, what does it actually mean to be royalty? What does it mean to be a monarch, especially in our world where monarchy is not historically a good thing? So, what does it mean to be in a position where you're elevated among above other people? And then specifically with Karina, she's also black, and like the fact that she's a black character can't be taken away from her, because like the princess archetype is not what we really see on a black character. So, what does it mean then for her to be black? How then is she existing within the framework of how the members of the black community, how I understand power, how we understand privilege, how we understand hierarchy? And so the inspiration there was really like trying to take the princess classic archetype and apply it to a black girl, and still also give her space to be wrong, to give her space to mess up. As we see in this excerpt I just read, Karina is very competitive. She will never say no to a challenge. It works out for her in this section I read, but throughout the whole book, there's some times where she probably actually should back down and she won't back down. And like that's one of her strengths. It's also one of her weaknesses. So part of her journey is also learning when it's actually better to let other people who know more take the lead and actually have the like humility to say, you know what, I'm wrong. And I just wanted to give her space to be two-dimensional, because I feel like so many girls, they feel like you can't ever say you're wrong, you can't ever mess up, you can't like ever be anything less than perfect, or else like you just everything you've worked for is going to go away.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Um, all genres have their shares of female stereotypes and tropes, and fantasy in many cultures the world over definitely has a spotty track record when it comes to portraying women and girls in a fair or positive manner. So how do you break stereotypes in to create a female character with agency while dealing with the world around her, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls?
So I think it's always super important, especially if you're going to include any kind of bigotry of any kind, if you're going to
Mhm.
include violence and particularly sexual violence because of just how triggering those can be, is being aware of the reality that these are things that people deal with, and like that these are not fiction for like my readers. Like I'm writing particularly to young black girls specifically, but just young girls
Right.
as a whole as well, and understanding like they've lived racism, they have lived sexual violence, they have lived harassment. Like this is not fiction for them. And so always coming from that respectful lens and with understanding there's a difference between being sort of real about these experiences on the page and like honoring like this is how it feels like to go through harassment, this is how it feels like to go through violence versus just the sake of re-traumatizing. And I give one example, I think Game of Thrones. I think that's a good example of like a show that just sort of throws in violence as shock, you know? And I say this as someone who did like Game of Thrones, but I also have lots of problems with it. It's very well known that they added lots of gratuitous rape scenes that weren't in the original books and lots of gratuitous violence and like lots of female characters who are alive in the book are dead in the show for no other reason than because it's shocking. And I think that is always what I want to avoid in my work. Like it should never be violence for the sake of violence or violence for the sake of shock. Um, and so I think then with female characters is always understanding that unfortunately having to navigate these systems of violence and oppression and subjugation is the reality of being a woman or a person of any marginalized gender in the world, just by the nature of how the world's set up. And so always approaching it with empathy and respect and like understanding how it actually feels to live in that space and not trying to re-traumatize readers, not just throwing it in for the sake of throwing it in there. And also giving my female characters like another thing is I feel like sometimes we feel like we have to make them perfect and we have to make sure they never do anything wrong, but I feel like that is also doing a disservice to them because like girls, women, people of marginalized genders, we are complicated, we are complex, like we have so many different layers to us. And I think it's so important to like be real and be honest about that and like write female characters who really embody all of those things. Like I write some who are very morally gray, who make unethical choices, very wrong decisions. And like I think to be real to female experiences to also be the way aware of the ways females can also perpetuate violence and the ways that we kind of internalize these systems that are used against us and how we intentionally or unintentionally end up replicating them. And it's not until we're aware of that that we can all really get together and fight against it.
Yeah, so just drawing on the fact that, you just said you do write women who are, ever get any flack for not making a female character likable enough?
Sometimes I've definitely gotten reviews like that. They're like, "Ah, oh, Karina's just she's so selfish," or like she just is always just worried about herself. Like there's definitely been people like that. And they're like, "I just don't like her," and I'm like, at the end of the day, I don't think my job is 100% to make her likable to everyone. Because number one, if that was possible, some writer would have already done that. Like no one can write a character everyone likes. And number two, like I'm not writing Barney here. Like I'm writing a real person. Like I think my job is not to make her likable, but my job is to make her understandable. Like whether or not you agree with Chris, there's some decisions she makes I would not make. Like if someone asked me, "Hey, here's an ancient spell of necromancy," I'd be like, "Maybe that's not a good idea. Let me not do that. Let me just not mess with the dead." And Karina does not make that decision. That's not spoiler. That's a plot. But like, there are just some choices she makes that I would not make, and just like, however, I want the reader to always understand where is her mindset at. Why in that moment would Karina think? Why would her grief be so strong that she truly believes she needs to do anything to bring her mother back to the dead? And I think that is any of us who have lost someone we love, who have gone through that kind of grief, we can understand that. Like that's an understandable emotion. Like when you're at that place of just such deep, all-encompassing grief, like even the most irrational choice will suddenly seem rational. So even if they're not like, no, I would definitely not do that. I don't like that. But I get why someone else might do that. I think if I can get a reader there, I think I've succeeded.
That's great. So moving on to our next question. Many authors, especially male authors, still stumble when it comes to passing the Bechdel test. So this is whereby female characters have conversations about topics other than men. Why do you think many genre authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are many more things that women talk about other than men?
I think it comes down to the fact that like so many people are ingrained in their idea of what fantasy is. And unfortunately, so many of those ideas of what fantasy is just naturally just do not have a lot of space for women. Like kind of think, especially here in the West, what are considered like the all-time sort of best fantasies? You have sort of Lord of the Rings, which does not have
Mm.
a lot of female characters in the main cast. I know there's a huge extended Middle Earth history that has lots of female characters, but I'm talking the main cast. You have like Chronicles of Narnia, which again like
Mm-hmm.
has like the sisters are half those are sisters, but like it's still mostly the boys. Edward and Peter are really important. You have like just example after example of what is considered fantasy is almost always just about men by men. That's kind of who's been elevated. And just so naturally, they sort of just gravitate towards what matters to them. And just in general, just what matters to men just kind of tends to be other men. And so I think a lot of people writing in that tradition, some of them aren't even intentionally doing it, but like they just sort of repeat it. Even Star Wars is a big one. With Star Wars, I argue all the time that Star Wars is just a fantasy set in space, and like the Force is literally just magic. Like they can call it whatever they want, but it's literally magic. But so Star Wars is essentially a fantasy. Like again, there's very few besides Leia female characters, and like there's just this idea that because there's so much blueprint of what a male narrative in fantasy looks like. King Arthur, all King Arthur's knights traditionally men. Like it's the blueprint for how you write a boy in fantasy is so ingrained in so many writers' minds that it's just easy for them to replicate that. But then the blueprint for what a girl looks like, the damsel in distress or the evil queen, or like even if you look at fairy tales, which the majority of fairy tales are about girls, and but the roles of those girls can be very limited. Um, the sort of blueprint, like what our understanding of this is what a girl in a fantasy looks like. I think unless you're doing conscious work to really go against that and really understand it, you're just going to kind of end up replicating it.
Yeah, that's actually very true. What can you then suggest for male writers who want to write female conversations, relationships, and friendships more realistically?
Honestly, get more female friends. Like that, that sounds so rude, but like I mean that genuinely because like the more time, just and this is naturally for anyone who's trying to understand a group they're not a part of and be able to like write them better. The more time you spend with them, the more time you understand their humanity, you see them as human, the more you're going to be naturally able to internalize that and put it on the page yourself. And the more you understand women, and not just on like women in your family, not just your wife, your mother, like women who are just your friends, like that don't have like this
Mm.
familiar romantic bond to you, but like you just respect them the same way you respect your male colleagues and like completely platonic. Because I think it'll open your eyes to just seeing women as 100% whole people with their own values and ideas and thoughts and processes. And then from that, reading more women writers, like really truly reading, not even just like sort of the big ones everyone knows, but really digging in to like see what like we're talking about and what we care about. And like even writers from marginalized genders who might not identify as women, just because the experience of lots of marginalized genders tend to overlap in the world just because of the way society treats us. And so really just understanding the sort of various ways people who are not cis men have to move through the world is really important.
Mm. No, and I don't think it's rude. Actually, I think a lot of authors in fact have also there has been an influx of more capable and strong female characters in YA and fantasy. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I love it. Like I personally think I love seeing like more and more different types of female characters,
Mm-hmm.
especially because like I think one thing I think YA in particular has been moving towards, which I really like, is there was a time period where like everyone's idea of strong character is like a girl with a sword. And here, look, I love a girl with a sword. Don't get me wrong. Like Mulan's one of my favorite movies. I am never gonna be against that. But I felt like for a little while we were kind of having the opposite problem where like, oh, to be strong, like every female character was like damsel in distress, right? And like suddenly it's like every female character needs to be able to physically fight her way out of every problem. And that felt weird to me too, because it felt like it was just a different box, you know? Like it just felt like, oh, okay, you guys are sick of that box. Here's your new box. This is your new box, and now be happy because it's new. And I'm like, I don't want a box. And I think like that's the thing. I think we're really moving towards this idea that like you don't have to be strong, you don't have to be dominating, you don't have to be aggressive, you don't have to like sort of replicate always super masculine traits to be strong, you know? And so I think we're really moving towards like I'm still seeing my girls with swords, but I'm seeing more girls who are allowed to occupy like that space where like they're physically weak. They're considered very emotional. They're considered like very honestly like quote unquote like girly, but like in a way that's not derogatory and in a way that's not seen as like you are not strong. And like that is something in sort of my next sort of protagonist I'm running. I really want to address and like kind of play around with like a character who is very much like kind of your stereotypical girly girl and who really isn't like the idea of like the punch kick butt kind of like heroine, but like she's still strong in her own right. And what does that strength look like? Because I think when I think the strongest woman I know, that's the kind of strength I see, like the everyday strength that it takes to like exist as a woman in this world and exist with dignity and personhood and agency. Like that is one of probably the strongest strengths I've ever seen. And that has nothing to do with like fighting.
So, male and female Malik is generally quite equitable. And in fact, Malik is a character that is very respectful of women and their thoughts and decisions. So, do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways that YA writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and dehumanization of women?
Oh, definitely 100%. And I feel like it's so important for like the same way, like when I talk about the box, the idea like this is what you have, I think challenging the box for boys too is super important for like the boys themselves and also the way the boys relate to the women in their lives. Because when I was writing the league, who I had in mind was actually my baby cousins. And like this idea that even they were so young, they were children, they were still being fed these sort of toxic masculinity ideals by like people in my own family and our culture. Like a man is always strong, a man is always tough, like a man never cries, a man blah 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 blah. And I was like, what if you're a boy who is naturally not like that? And like that's just not who you are. That's just not what you're capable of being. How then do you still find strength and
Mm.
agency? Especially when you're taught like I feel like so many men, because they feel like the only way they can get respect, the only way they can prove themselves as not being lesser is by finding someone who's lesser than them. And to them, that's always going to be women. So they take out what they feel is lacking in them on the women in their lives and they kind of perpetuate this cycle. So I really want to show Malik as a character in this world who he's very compassionate, he's nurturing, he's emotional, he's prone to crying. And this is a world that actually does not really reward those traits. Like Malik understands that if he was more like his father, if he was more like the other men in his life, his life would be easier. But he's just not. He's fundamentally not that person. So it's really important for me to show like how then in a world that would honestly reward toxic masculinity, because the thing is, the ugly secret of our world is we always tell boys don't give into toxic masculinity. But the problem is they understand from a young age, we know that like this world rewards toxic masculinity. It rewards the guy who was like the strongest, the fastest, the guy who was like always talking over everyone else and who does everything to get by. Like we love dudes like that. We make them the movie stars. Like that's the type of stories we tell. So we're always saying, "Oh, don't do toxic masculinity," but like we're suddenly reinforcing, like, if you buy into it, though, you're gonna succeed. You're gonna get the like ups in life. So how then, actually, if you were in a system which truly will reward toxic masculinity, how then do you actually fight against that and choose? You know what? I'm going to do the right thing, even if it's not actually what's gonna be beneficial to me.
So, I mean, do you think that eventually then that violent alpha male type character would phase out from YA fantasy as cultures worldwide start kicking out toxic masculinity? Or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that would stick around for a longer
I
time?
feel like if I want to be realistic, I don't see it going anywhere in the sense that as long as within our society, those traits are things that are considered admirable, they're always going to have a fantasy element. Like, for example, a big conversation of romance lately has been the billionaire hero. For example, we all know billionaires, it's unethical. There is no ethical way someone amasses that much wealth. Every single billionaire has gone through some extremely heinous means to get that much money, and they have exploited labor into an disgusting degree to get that much money. But the billionaire hero keeps on selling ridiculous amounts of copies because like readers love it, and because there's a certain aspirational quality, like especially here in America, the whole raise yourself by your bootstraps mentality, and like anyone can
Right.
become a millionaire or billionaire if they work hard enough. Like it's something that's to admire and something to aspire to, and like there's a slight fantasy element to it, like the fantasy of being with the billionaire, being with the alpha male. And so I do think that as long as our society is honestly sort of elevating those traits and like showing them as something to aspire to, it's not going to go away. However, I do think we are creating more room for like counter narratives, and we're creating more room for more protagonists like Malik and more men who really do defy that. And like, I think it's happening slowly, but I do think it's happening.
Right. So, okay, we have another question from our audience, also from Julia Costa. Did you use
Hmm. Yes. So yes, I did. So I used my own experience. So there is a slight difference with Malik. So Malik is specifically a refugee. And I did that because I was very inspired by the refugee crisis that was happening in the late 2010s and is still happening with
uh-huh,
West Africa to Europe.
right?
And so with Malik, like he and his family have been forced out because of sort of interclan violence in his region, and they are an ethnic minority in their world. And he's come to Zoran at the time, and like we see him, not only is he like dealing with the plot of the novel, trying to save his sister, he's also dealing with just the shock of being in a new area and like trying to assimilate, and he cannot assimilate, and knowing that like his people aren't wanted there, and like his survival just by being who he is threatened. Um, and so while I myself am not a refugee, my experience as an immigrant did sort of come into that, just the feeling of being in a completely new environment, being in a place you might not necessarily like, these people don't necessarily want you there, but you kind of have nowhere else to go. And that feeling of just the complete fish out of water, like the land being ripped from beneath you, literally, and being placed somewhere else and just trying to be told how to survive. Well, not even being told to how to survive, you're being told to survive, but not how to. And sort of the struggles my family went with that definitely sort of informed Malik's journey. It definitely informed him. I am very grateful. My family has not been refugees, so I can't claim that experience. But the experience of being a person from another culture, having to just suddenly survive in a new one, that is something that definitely inspired Malik.
So that is one of the influences to Malik's character.
Yes.
So, going back to our cluster of questions, the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, like we were talking about earlier. So, do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I definitely think, yeah, and I definitely think some authors definitely do it better than others. But
Mhm.
like, there's just, I feel like it's a difficult thing to talk about because there's just so many layers to it, which is like, I know that's gonna sound bad because consent, no is always no. This is 100%,
Yeah.
100% unshakable truth. But in fantasy, it's like there's so many things that like we consider, like we're just kind of like the classic one, the true love's kiss, right? We see this
Mhm.
in Snow White, we see this in Sleeping Beauty. We're just taught like we're, oh, that is so romantic. Like, oh look, he kissed this woman who was asleep in the woods and now he saved the kingdom. And we're just taught that as like unquestioning, like this is a good thing, and therefore his actions were justified because a good thing happened. Oh look, she woke up and she wasn't okay with it. She was okay with it, so it's fine. But of course, realistically, we don't know if she like, because we're not presented the
Right.
narrative like, what if she woke up and she actually wasn't okay with it? What if she woke up like, wow, I actually feel very violated. Someone kissed me while I was asleep. Like that counter narrative, but it's very hard to like kind of present that when the other story is just so, it's such a foundational bedrock of how we see fantasy, like the idea of the true love's kiss, the idea that anything you do in the name of the greater good is okay. Or
Right.
if you did in the name of true love, it's okay. That's something I actually explore in rates, like the idea that when does love get to supersede consent? And the answer is never. But like, unfortunately, we are taught that, like, oh, I did this in the name of true love, so it's okay. Oh, I kidnapped you, but it was for your own good, so it's okay. And how actually that's very, very messed up. And I definitely think I'm seeing more fantasy writers these days really kind of explore that idea that like a lot of what we've been taught about what fantasy and romance looks like is actually really unhealthy and just cannot be replicated in the real world, even though like I get the romance of it. Like I get the like romance of the true love's kiss, like, oh, you're in trouble, your true love is gonna come save you no matter what. But just in reality, that's just not how the world
Yeah.
works. And like if you haven't talked about it with your true love beforehand, they better not be going around kissing random people before it. So
No, yeah. I mean, actually, just that leads us to our next set of questions, because stories like Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about cultural change. So, in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence without making it dramatic or preachy?
I think it comes back to kind of what I was saying earlier about just always striking, understanding that this is something that really happens to people, and like understanding where is the violence, not the violence, sorry, where is the fantasy element and where is the real life element, where are they meeting, where is that line, and always being intentional about hitting that line, because like you never want to be someone who's just throwing the stuff in and so you've crossed the line and you didn't realize it and you've gone from fantasy into traumatizing. Like you got to know where that line is and always be aware you're towing it, because the more like you're aware of it, the more like you are to like handle it with the balance that these two topics are going to need.
Mhm. So then, do you think that it's important for influential authors such as yourself, who are read all over the world, to make a conscious effort to include characters in their stories that show readers the importance of respecting women as equals and human beings?
Of course, yeah. And I think that comes down to not even necessarily having an agenda like, oh, let me write powerful women, but just like I think the author's job is to reflect the world. And the truth of the world is that like women and people of marginalized genders, we exist in the world and we have every right to take up space. We deserve to have personhood in this world. And so like as an author, if you're not doing that, like you're actually just not doing your job. And so
Mhm.
like if you can't write women and people of marginalized genders as like full complex human beings, like you're not a very good writer just because like you aren't actually writing the world. You are writing a fantasy of the world in which only cis men have any sort of power, only exist. And that's just not how, even though the system is set up in that way in many places, that's never been the truth of the world. There's always been people fighting back against that who've all found ways to not just survive, but thrive within that system. And to not acknowledge that is just to not acknowledge the truth of the world.
Yeah, the reality of the world, right?
Hmm.
So, geek culture in general, including YA fantasy, has had its fair share of critiques saying that it's still too male dominated despite a rising number of prominent, well respected, and well known female authors. Plus, there's also been criticism of male geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming, more welcoming to girls?
I think two things. Number one, I want to see more women and people of marginalized genders like in positions of power. Really, like not just. I think like we have a lot on the creator level. There's definitely a lot, and that's great. But I mean like in the boardroom level, executive levels, like the ones making the big shots, like at places like Marvel, Star Wars, DC, like really calling the big shots, because those are in those boardrooms. So many of those choices happen, and like people are talking about like, oh, about the female character in this movie, but like that movie's not even getting made if the decision isn't being made at the top level for
Mm.
the movie to even happen, you know? So like we need more people in those positions to really fight for these other positions and to other fight for these other narratives. And then number two, I think for so long, geekdom has been a space in which so many toxic fans have been allowed to thrive, and so much toxicity and things, and like there's this definitely this vanguard in geekdom and fandom that sees that like anyone who is not a cis man moving into geekdom is a threat to it.
Right.
And I think a lot of like sort of the bigger companies have been scared to speak out against it because they're worried about losing their core audience, losing their core fan base. We've seen this with Star Wars a lot, how Kelly Marie Tran was harassed off social media after her after The Last Jedi, right?
Yeah.
And so those people, they consider themselves Star Wars fans. They consider themselves like a core part of the audience. And they're the ones who bully the Star Wars actor off the social media. And so I think more needs to be done by the people, like to not hide, like the people in charge to not hide, not give spaces for these people creating toxicity to hide. And I want to make it clear, this is not all fans 100%. Like this is not like every male Star Wars fan is like toxic. Like no, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying the ones who are have had too much like power to like kind of dictate how the space exists for the rest of us and push other people out. And so much the reason they've been felt embodied to do that is because they know that like the big haunters are going to keep catering to them because they feel like without them they might not make money, and that's just not true. And like honestly, like they have more money to gain, honestly, because we live in capitalist society. It comes down to money. If you really go out and like you do more inclusive storytelling, you reach out to more marginalized like fans, more girl fans, more fans of color, and really sort of like bring them into the spaces, as we've seen with things like Black Panther, Crazy Rich Asians.
Mm,
Like we see that those like the people will come through for those narratives, and they've been so scared for so long. So like the work needs to be done to stop making fandom be a place where these toxic fans feel safe.
yeah, no, that's true. In fact, we have a comment from Regina. Talk about fantasy. Check out how the fanboys attacked movies like the all-female Ghostbusters movie and Captain Marvel.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember that. I saw Captain Marvel. I did not see Ghostbusters. Oh no, wait, I saw both. Wait, what am I talking about? I saw Captain Marvel on airplane. I saw Ghostbusters on TV. But like, no, yeah, like definitely, like there's a whole contingent of fandom who they hear like a beloved property is being marketed towards women now, and suddenly they're just determined to like shoot it down. And like the thing is, they'll give any reason besides the fact it's women now that to be like, oh no, it's not like they're women. It's just like we think it's bad, but like without acknowledging like they're being more critical of it because it's mostly women now, and like they're nitpicking things they wouldn't nitpick if it was men.
Before,
And
yeah.
so it's definitely a very important like, and I think again like it comes down to the fact that they have felt so safe in these fandom spaces because they know that like the big head honchos are not going to stop this kind of talk. And so I think with trolls, unfortunately, there's not much you can do for the trolls themselves, but you can create spaces where the trolls themselves are not going to be heard. And I think that's the most important thing.
Yep. Amen to that. One of the reasons violence against women exists in gender inequality, do you think there will ever be a time when there will be complete equality between genders?
Oh gosh, that I feel like you're asking me to solve like, will there be world peace? I'm like, I mean, like I I do think that the work that is being done now, the continue. Okay, you know that quote, like the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I
Right.
cannot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to say Martin Luther King said that because I feel like he was quoting someone else when he said it. So I don't remember who I originally heard of, who originally said it, but I know Martin Luther King said that once. I truly believe that just the fact that people are still fighting for better and people are still out there doing what they can on grassroots level, fighting for their neighbors, for themselves, for their families, I do think that's never going to stop. And I do think that like we've seen strides very slowly but surely over the decades for more equity and for more ethical and like just fairer conditions for women all over the world and people marginalized
Hmm.
genders. And so I do think that like if the fight could not keep happening, like decades ago, not even just decades, centuries ago, like if it wasn't possible to keep fighting, women would have given up and just accepted the lots that had been handed to them, and they didn't, and they still don't. And so I do think that like, and so while I say 100% everything will be perfect one day, I can't see the future. I can't promise that, but I do think that the fight's gonna keep happening, and as long as there are people who are willing to say this is wrong, this is not okay, we're not gonna stand for this. I do think that like there's always going to be space to be better, and there's going to be space to do better by ourselves in our community.
Right. So we're finally at our last cluster of questions. You have been so incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women as a whole. So these questions are Captain Obvious questions. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
I mean, I support it because like for me, it's when I think about my own life, and not even just my own life, my family, my mother, my aunties, my cousins, that's what
Mm-hmm.
we've had to go through to survive as Black women, as immigrants, as just trying to exist in this society, in this world. And like when I think of the way violence has like touched our lives in the very obvious ways, but also the not obvious ways, I think when I think about those things, I don't think about so much the pain and all that, but I just think about what would our lives look like if those hadn't happened, and like in what ways would we be able to thrive? In what ways, if we weren't always in survival mode, would we be able to think about ourselves and our wellness? Would we be able to give back to our communities? And so I support that because I truly think every girl, every person of marginalized gender deserves the right to like live when they're not feeling terrorized and not feeling like their survival is at a constant threat.
Right. What do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I feel like I've given this answer 3 times, but it's because I still believe it. I think it comes down to writing with intention. If you're going to write violence in your book, understand what is the role of violence in your work. Like, and like again, don't pull the Game of Thrones. Let me just throw in a rape scene because I think that's what's gonna spice this up. Like, if you're gonna talk like about it, make sure you know what you're talking about and like you are understanding like what is going on there. Because again, I don't think the answer is like never talk about sexual assault, never talk about like violence in books. Like, I know some people believe that, but I honestly don't think that's the answer either. But I do think it's understanding like what are you adding to conversation? What are you saying here? What places is having in the work? Because I think until authors can do that and be honest with themselves about when they're just being like, let me just throw it in to throw it in, and when they're like, no, I'm going to examine this and like really look at it and see like kind of what is going on here. That's when we're going to have a better understanding and like have readers really think about the role of violence and the ways it's affected them and the ways they perpetuate it.
So we have one final question from our audience, also from Julia Costa.
Hello, Julia.
What is it like to be a Black woman in the publishing market, which is still predominantly male and white?
Whew, okay. It definitely, it is difficult because definitely it feels like, like the story of Sisyphus rolling the boulder up the hill, and no matter how far he gets, the boulder just keeps rolling down. Like it feels like you're pushing and you're pushing and you're pushing, and sometimes like you'll get to a moment where you get kind of just stop, and you're like, wow, I've come so far, but it just keeps pushing and pushing, and it feels like you never stop, and like sometimes like you'll go through something, like you'll be like, oh wow, I managed to get my publisher to do X, Y, Z, and you'll hear a story from like another white author or a male author and be like, oh, what? Like, I didn't even ask and they just did it. And you're just like, oh gosh, that was such a fight to even get them to do this. And like, they're just handing it to someone else. And that can be very demoralizing. And this understanding that like, you're still being treated different. Like the things that other people are just giving, you still have to fight for. But
Right.
I think the best part of that has been the community because I am coming like of age in my career at a time when there's probably more Black women writing in YA than has ever been there before. And being able to be community with these women and share these experiences and be like, no, this is not just you. This is happening to all of us, and it's BS, and we're not going to take it. Has been so
Mhm.
amazing, and having them to lean on and to have that community to go back to has been just incredible.
Well, thank you, Julia, for that question. And that wraps up our Q&A session for today. So just to repeat what Rosie has generously donated, essentially Rosie has donated a couple of exclusive goodies to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. Available to US donors only. Rosie has a very special treat for one US based Read for Pixels donor, which is a paperback copy of A Song of Wraiths and Ruins, signed and personalized for the donor, and a set of A Song of Wraiths and Ruin pre-order incentive pack, which includes a bookplate, a bookmark, and 2 character cards. The second goodie, which is available to donors worldwide, is a 40-minute one-to-one online video chat with Rosie. Rosie has generously donated a 45-minute one-to-one video chat to be claimed by one lucky Read for Pixels donor who is an aspiring author or book fan. Rosie will be happy to chat about everything from African folklore to the art and craft of writing powerful and unique YA fantasy with you. You may choose to have this video call via Zoom or Skype. There are also plenty more author goodies available from authors Dean, Sarah Rees Brennan, Janine Lin, Julie Cerneda, Paul Tremblay, Sebastian de Castel, Dutton Books, Entangled Publishing, and more. New goodies will be released every week throughout this September. We've currently raised $2,615 towards our $5,000 goal, which is a little slow, so please give generously before the fundraiser ends in October 2021. All of the funds go to the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides for the audience, just so they can see where they can go to donate goodies. So you can donate to get these goodies on RallyUp at http://bit.ly/r4p RallyUp 2021. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels, bit.ly/read for pixels. So our moderators will be sharing these links up in the chat box. Um, just to let our audience know as well, we have the Pixel Project's first charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, where the Twilight Zone meets Promising Young Woman, has also been released on the 1st of September this year. Additionally, we have teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer an exclusive limited edition anthology bookplate for early bird buyers. Each author will sign 16 bookplates, and it'll be first come first serve. Each bookplate includes a resource for domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in 205 countries. So for more information about the anthology and how to score a bookplate, do visit http://bit.ly/giving the devil his due, or you can order it from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. All net proceeds from the anthology will go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives, such as this one, alive and kicking. So yes, to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, you may visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Rosie, if you have any comments or announcements, you can make them now.
So thank you all so much for coming here. Thank you so much, Tanisha, for your amazing questions. Thank you all, everyone. And so for me, A Song of Race and Ruin, the sequel, A Psalm of Storms and Silence, is going to be out on November 2nd, 2021. So if you like the first book, please, please, please consider picking up the second one, especially because there's lots of supply chain issues right now. And so it's going to be, it's kind of, no, it's a toss up to kind of say how many books are going to be available when the book comes out. So your best way to guarantee your copy is to pre-order one. And if you can't afford to pre-order right now, you can always go to your library and request they buy a copy. That helps authors a lot too. So that's a great way. So please, yes. And if you want more information about myself and my work, you can follow me at Rosie's Rambles, ROSIES Rambles, on Twitter and Instagram to have updates on what I'm up to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rosie. And thank you to our audience today. Have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. Bye.
Bye, all.